All right, let's talk about the High Lords of Terra, those shadowy figures who sit at the pinnacle of humanity's authority, commanding from the heart of the Imperium. On paper, they are the ultimate rulers of mankind, the ones who steer the Imperium's fate from their thrones within the hallowed halls of the Imperial Palace. But let's be honest, if you've been in the Warhammer 40k fandom for any length of time, you've probably asked yourself the same question we all have at some point. Are they really the ones in control? There's a chilling sense of unease when you start digging into the institution of the High Lords. It's not just the formal power they hold, but the eerie way they operate, distant, untouchable, and above reproach. They rarely speak publicly, they're rarely seen, and even within the Adeptus Terra, most don't know what decisions are made, or by whom exactly. It's that silence, that perfect bureaucratic fog, that makes them so unnerving. The deeper you look, the more it feels like something, or someone, is pulling strings behind the curtain. That fear isn't just a narrative device, it's a cultural artifact within the Imperium itself. Entire sects of administratum scribes live and die without ever knowing who truly signed the edicts they spend their lives enforcing. Civilians across 1,000,000 worlds will never hear a single name from the Senatorum Imperialis. And even among space marines, inquisitors, and tech priests, rumors circulate, whispers of voices that don't match any known official, of policies enacted with no traceable origin. In a galaxy ruled by fear, this might be the most terrifying truth of all, that the throne is merely a front. Because what if the High Lords aren't the end of the chain of command? What if they're just masks, noble masks, powerful masks, but still masks? And if that's true, who wears the face behind them? This question, are there hidden powers behind the High Lords of Terra, is more than a curiosity. It's a splinter under the skin of the lore. It has fueled countless fan theories, driven deep dives into obscure Black Library passages, and kept lore nerds up at night with one terrifying possibility: the Imperium's masters may themselves be servants. Today, we're diving headfirst into that paranoia, because where there's smoke on Terra, there's always fire. When we talk about the High Lords of Terra, most people immediately picture a shadowy council of 12 ancient figures, cloaked in authority and mystery. And yeah, that's technically accurate. 12 seats, each representing the most powerful institutions in the Imperium. But the truth is, it's not really about who they are. It's about what they represent. Because the Senatorum Imperialis, for all its official glory, feels less like a government and more like a volatile balancing act between rival empires pretending to be on the same side. Let's break it down a bit. The 12 High Lords are drawn from the mightiest organizations in the Imperium: the Adeptus Administratum, the Ecclesiarchy, the Astra Militarum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Navis Nobilitae, the Inquisition, the Officio Assassinorum, and so on. Not all of these positions are fixed, by the way. Some rotate, others are left empty, and some are filled by, let's say, creative substitutions. The idea is that each High Lord represents a pillar of imperial power. In theory, that sounds stable. In reality, it feels more like a collection of apex predators forced to share the same den. Here's where it gets really wild. No one knows exactly how some of these people are chosen. Sure, some appointments are clear, like the Ecclesiarch, who is the head of the Ministorum and usually ascends through brutal theological and political infighting. But others? Sometimes it's inheritance, sometimes it's selection from within a shadowy inner circle, and sometimes it's, well, nobody's quite sure. There are recorded instances of High Lords taking their seats without public announcement, with no traceable career path, as if they appeared fully formed out of the void. And that brings us to one of the most frustrating and fascinating truths about this ruling body. Legitimacy doesn't always equal competence. Some High Lords are terrifyingly capable. They move the gears of galactic civilization with a word. Others? They're there because they're loyal to someone more dangerous. There have been cases where a Lord Militant of the Astra Militarum barely had field experience, or where a representative of the Navigator houses had more interest in personal profit than stellar policy, but they were still in power, still shaping the future of humanity with every breath. This chaos is often masked by ceremony. The High Lords wear robes woven with sacred symbols. They sit on thrones crafted during the earliest days of the Imperium, and every decree they issue is sanctified with rites older than most star systems. But that sacred theater hides the grinding reality of internal politics. These are not philosopher kings, nor selfless servants of mankind. They are survivors of a brutal system that rewards manipulation and punishes transparency. And once you understand that, you start to see the Council in a new light, not as rulers, but as prisoners in a very gilded cage. Another layer of complexity comes from the fact that not all High Lords are equal. Some wield genuine power that can shift the fate of entire sectors. Others are practically ornamental. A High Lord from the Administratum may control the logistics of 1,000 crusades, while another from a lesser institution may be little more than a rubber stamp. This imbalance breeds tension and, some say, resentment. The quiet war between these factions never really stops. Every vote, every decision, every decree is the result of backroom dealings and whispered threats. It's politics at its rawest. And here's where the real paranoia begins to set in. Because with such an unstable balance of power, it's hard not to wonder if some seats are there just to keep the others in check. Or worse, if some exist to watch the rest on behalf of a master no one acknowledges. There's an old Terran saying among Administratum clerks, "If you can name 11 lords, start fearing the 12th." It's a joke mostly, but there's a layer of dread to it that never quite fades. The High Lords are supposed to be known, documented, filed, but sometimes they aren't. You can imagine what that does to the conspiracy theorists. Some say that the 12th seat is never fixed because it's reserved for hidden hands, the Inquisition, the Officio Assassinorum, or even someone outside the Adeptus entirely. Others claim that a permanent figure exists, cloaked by illusion or false records, and that this entity has been guiding Terra's fate for thousands of years. There's even a theory that one of the seats is permanently empty, symbolically, because its occupant doesn't sit among mortals at all, but sends instructions from somewhere deep beneath the palace or beyond the veil of reality. But even without leaning into the deep lore rabbit holes, the official structure alone is enough to raise questions. Because you don't have to believe in shadow overlords to feel that something's off. Just look at how the High Lords behave, always reactive, never proactive. They shuffle resources, authorize exterminatus, and declare new crusades, but they never seem to lead. The Imperium lurches forward on inertia, not vision. And that's the most damning criticism of all, because if these are our leaders, then who is actually steering the ship? There's a bitter joke that echoes through the lower ranks of the Administratum. The Emperor rules from the Golden Throne, and the High Lords rule from the shadows of his silence. It's said with the kind of dry resignation only bureaucrats can perfect. But it hits close to home. Because the longer you observe the High Lords in action or inaction, the more you start to suspect that power in the Imperium doesn't flow downward from the top. It flows sideways in hidden currents and forgotten corridors. And somewhere along those corridors, just maybe, there are hands that guide the hands that sign the orders. There's something deeply unsettling about how easily members of the Senatorum Imperialis can just vanish. Not die in battle, not retire in glory, not even publicly fall from grace. I mean literally vanish. Gone overnight, their names scrubbed from official records, their faces removed from public murals, and their legacies quietly swallowed by the machine. And the worst part? It happens more often than you'd think. We're not talking about minor bureaucrats here. These are the supposed rulers of mankind, the apex of imperial hierarchy, and yet they can be replaced like faulty cogitators. No warning, no announcement, and sometimes not even a name for their successor. Take the case of High Lord Varnak from the Administratum. By all accounts, he was a stalwart fixture in the council, a conservative hardliner who blocked multiple crusade expansions due to resource concerns. One day, He's issuing mandates on sector-level tithing. The next, gone. Not killed, not disgraced, just erased. His successor appeared weeks later, an obscure figure from an off-world accounting enclave no one had heard of, with no prior mention in any major databanks. Even more suspiciously, all references to Varnak's term were retroactively corrected to reflect his absence, as if he was never there, as if he'd never existed at all. It gets even weirder when you consider the case of Lady Seraphine Hellas, once a representative of the ecclesiarchy. Her tenure was marked by zealous orthodoxy and harsh doctrinal enforcement, especially against perceived tech heresies. She publicly clashed with Mechanicus envoys and openly criticized the Omnissiah cult. Then, right after a closed meeting with a delegation from Mars, she was declared no longer fit for duty. That was the official statement. Nothing about illness, nothing about death, no funeral, no exile, just a line in an announcement and silence ever since. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a pattern that's too deliberate to ignore. Each time a High Lord disappears under suspicious circumstances, there's a noticeable power vacuum, quickly filled, of course, but always in a way that seems convenient for someone. And here's where the fan theories really kick in. A lot of people believe that these removals aren't political, they're surgical. That someone, or some group, is actively purging individuals who become too dangerous, too independent, or too inconvenient to the grand design. One of the most popular theories among lore enthusiasts is that there's a secret tribunal operating behind the Senatorum. Not the Inquisition, not the Assassinorum. Something older, something even the High Lords fear. This theory suggests that whenever a lord gets too curious or too resistant to suggested courses of action, they get quietly excised, replaced by someone more malleable. Someone who knows better than to ask questions. And honestly, when you look at the frequency of these silent purges, it starts to feel less like a theory and more like policy. Some speculate that the Ordo Chronos, the time-warped guardians of imperial temporal stability, might be involved. They're practically ghosts themselves, believed by many to have been dissolved or worse, lost in some paradox. But what if they're not gone? What if they're operating from the shadows, erasing those whose choices could lead the Imperium down a doomed path? That kind of temporal interference could explain the memory wipes, the record corrections, the uncanny silence surrounding certain removals. Others point to the Alpha-class Psychers, those rare, terrifyingly powerful individuals who can alter perception and memory. What if someone is using them not just to manipulate events, but to rewrite history in real time? What if the High Lords who vanish are literally being removed from collective memory, not killed, not exiled, but overwritten? Then there's the old whisper of the Null Lords, a name that pops up in deep lore forums and fan codexes, supposedly referencing a forgotten protocol within the ancient systems of the Golden Throne. According to this theory, when someone violates an unspoken rule of the Imperium, one too sacred or dangerous to even name, they don't get judged or punished. They get nullified, removed from the flow of history entirely, like a corrupted data file, clean, silent, and irreversible. It's hard not to feel paranoid when looking at this pattern. One day, you have a High Lord with a decades-long public presence, speeches broadcast to 1 million worlds. Then they're gone. No statues, no mourning, no recorded speeches. Replaced by someone with little background, but plenty of quiet backing. And somehow, nobody protests. Nobody even blinks. The mechanism just keeps turning. To most Imperials, this means nothing. The average citizen will never know a High Lord's name, much less track their career. But for us, the ones who pay attention, the ones who care about the machinery behind the facade, it's a red flag. Because a political system that erases people so cleanly isn't just authoritarian, it's something worse. It's self-aware. And once you notice it, you start seeing ghosts everywhere. Every High Lord with a suspiciously blank past. Every appointment that doesn't quite make sense. Every council vote where a dissenting voice goes silent just before it would have mattered. It's like there's a hand you can't see, brushing pieces off the board before the rest of us even realize the game has changed. And you have to ask yourself, if someone is behind it all, watching from above, then maybe the High Lords aren't rulers at all. Maybe they're just pieces themselves. And the real player? He's never on the board. There's something deeply off about some of the decisions that come out of Terra. I'm not talking about the usual Imperial overreach, like declaring a planet exterminatus over a heretical pamphlet, or sentencing an entire regiment to death for tactical retreat. No, I mean those moments where a decree is so sudden, so surgically precise, that it couldn't have originated from the sluggish, infighting-prone behemoth that is the Senatorum Imperialis. It's like watching a wounded giant suddenly move with predatory grace, and every time it happens, the same question lingers. Who whispered the order? One of the most notorious examples is the sudden deployment of a black ship flotilla to Segmentum Obscurus during the final years of M36. On record, the High Lords authorized the operation due to a suspected rise in uncontrolled psyker births. But here's the kicker. None of the data from local administrative archives supports that spike. No census, no subsector alert, nothing to justify a massive extraction campaign. Yet the decree was enacted instantly, skipping the usual layers of bureaucratic deadlock. Dozens of worlds were scoured in under a year. Entire hive populations were thinned. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica remained silent. The Inquisition denied involvement. And the High Lords? They never even acknowledged the order beyond that initial directive. There are other instances too, operations so perfectly timed, so neatly executed, they feel orchestrated by a hand with far more precision and insight than any official chain of command allows. One such case was the abrupt dissolution of the Forge Charter between Mars and the Lathe worlds in M40. This agreement had stood for over 4,000 years, binding key resources and production rights between the Mechanicus sectors. Then, in a single cycle, it was nullified. The High Lords claimed it was due to strategic reassessment, but the Martian delegation was blindsided. So were half a dozen Forge worlds reliant on the shared agreements. Rumor has it that the Adeptus Mechanicus only found out through intercepted astropathic chatter after the edict was dispatched. It's moments like these that fuel the more grounded conspiracy theories. Not the warp-born shadow councils or time-ghost inquisitors, but the belief that some entity, whether a hidden branch of the Inquisition, a buried technocracy within the palace, or a cabal of rogue psychers, is capable of feeding directives directly into the administrative bloodstream of the Imperium. Not through open decree, but through quiet coercion. A signature here, a silence there, a falsified report left on the right desk. No one questions it, because questioning means drawing attention, and in the Imperium, attention is often a death sentence. One story that still gives me chills is the so-called silent reforging of the Klybo Protocol. It was a fleet redeployment order during the War of the Blind Stars. At the time, the Imperium's navy was stretched thin, dealing with chaos incursions in 3 separate war zones. Then, out of nowhere, a new route was plotted. A strategic corridor through what had been classified as impassable space. Naval Command resisted at first, citing historical anomalies, warp instability, and logistical nightmares. But the order had already come through, fully signed, sealed, and confirmed by multiple High Lords, despite records showing at least 4 of them were off-world during the council session. What's even stranger? The corridor worked. Warp storms subsided, passage was cleared, and a fleet moved through a supposedly cursed region untouched. Some say it was a miracle. Others believe someone, or something, knew it would be safe. But who? Who had the foresight or the data to make that call? This pattern continues in smaller but no less disturbing ways. Adjustments to astropathic blackout zones, classified override of Ordo Hereticus kill lists, resource reallocation that contradicts active war zone reports. You'd think these contradictions would spark outrage, or at least investigation. But no, the gears keep turning. And when something doesn't add up, it's quietly rewritten. It's not that the High Lords can't make decisions. It's that the ones that make you stop and say, wait, how did that happen so fast? Those rarely seem to come from them. And we all know how slowly the Imperium moves. It can take years to approve a mining drill, but an order for a sector-wide withdrawal can go out overnight? Please. So who's really pulling those strings? A lot of fans point to the Inquisition, specifically factions within the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus, who are known for operating well beyond their official remit. Others whisper about rogue Mechanicus factions, like the Pale Synod or the rumored biologist enclave beneath Luna, whose tech wisdom might grant them unseen influence over data flows and communications. Some even point to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, suggesting they've developed psionic influence methods far beyond what we're allowed to know. But no matter which theory you lean into, the feeling is the same. These decisions don't feel organic. They don't feel like the product of a council of mortals arguing over a table. They feel like they come from something colder, smarter, maybe even inhuman. And the most disturbing part? No one in the Imperium will ever admit that, because to do so would be to accept a truth far more terrifying than chaos or Xenos or the collapse of a star system. It would mean admitting that humanity's rulers may not be ruling at all, that they're reacting to commands from ghosts, from shadows, from the faceless. If there's one faction in the Imperium that seems just a little too silent, a little too composed in the face of the galaxy burning, it's the Adeptus Mechanicus. They're not loud. They don't posture like the Ecclesiarchy or march in the open like the Astra Militarum. But their presence is everywhere, hidden behind every cogitator, humming inside every void ship reactor, pulsing beneath the circuitry of entire hive cities. And that's why so many of us in the lore community have started wondering if they're not just the backbone of the Imperium, but its unseen puppeteers. Let's be real. Mars isn't just a Forge world, it's the Forge world, the heart of the cult Mechanicus, the first colony beyond Terra, and the one place in the Imperium where the dogma of the machine is law, not the Imperial creed. Even though there's that uneasy Treaty of Olympus binding Mars and Terra in a so-called equal alliance, we all know it's more like a Cold War with paperwork. The Fabricator General, who sometimes even sits as a High Lord, is technically beholden to the rest of the Council, but have you ever seen the Mechanicus take orders from anyone? Here's the thing. While everyone's watching the High Lords, the tech priests are watching everything else. They control the noosphere. They maintain the data. They design the systems that move armies and planets. If they wanted to influence decision-making without ever stepping into the Senatorum, they could do it in their sleep. Corrupt a few files, adjust a few star maps, redirect a few shipments. It would look like coincidence, but it would be orchestration. And that's exactly what some fans believe is happening. There's a term that pops up now and then in deep lore discussions, the Hidden Synod of Mars. Supposedly, it's a council within the Mechanicus so secret, even most Magi don't know it exists. Not part of the cult hierarchy, not beholden to the Fabricator General. Just a collection of ancient minds, some post-organic, others fused into AI-adjacent machine intelligences, who make the real decisions. They don't just build engines, they build history. Quietly, efficiently, ruthlessly. We've seen hints of this in the fluff if you look closely. Moments where the Mechanicus moves before anyone else, as if reacting to data no one else has. Like when Mars redirected an entire Forge fleet toward the Halo stars before even the Inquisition had flagged the Necron tombs awakening there. Or when the Lathe Worlds withdrew support from an active crusade hours before a warp rift devoured the sector. Not days, hours. And they didn't explain why. They didn't have to. They knew. And it goes deeper. Some of the really fringe theories go so far as to say that certain STCs, those legendary standard template constructs from the dark age of technology, never disappeared. That they're still functional, still consulted, but only by the Hidden Synod. If that's true, then the Mechanicus may have access to predictive systems, logic engines, or even pre-heresy simulations that let them foresee events in a way no other branch of the Imperium can. Not prophecy, code. There's also the question of black projects. We know about the Ordinatus engines, the Thanatar-class siege automata, the Arc Mechanicus vessels, all of which exist in such limited numbers and under such tight control that even Imperial records barely acknowledge them. But what about the things we don't know? There are whispers of void craft built without warp drives, of machines that operate in real space without fuel, of artificially created psychers. None of this is confirmed, obviously, but the fact that these rumors exist at all says something about the scope of the Mechanicus' silence. And remember, the Imperium doesn't run on faith alone. It runs on systems. The astropathic relays, the orbital manufactoria, the Titan engines, and the Ordinatus platforms, they all rely on the Mechanicus. If the High Lords issue an order and the Magos says, no, what happens? Nothing. The gears stop turning, and that's power. One of the most fascinating theories I've come across suggests that the Fabricator General isn't even the most powerful figure on Mars. That there's another level above him, a collective machine consciousness, some fans call it the Martian Oracle, that exists as a distributed intelligence across the data cores of Mars itself. Not a god, not the Omnissiah, something between. A post-human mind guiding Mars from within, so old and vast it doesn't even recognize individual humans anymore. It sees trends, probabilities, outcomes, and perhaps it feeds those to the Fabricator General like divine insight. There's a cold logic to that theory that makes it feel terrifyingly plausible. After all, what's more Mechanicus than elevating a neural network to priesthood status? If this Martian Oracle exists, it wouldn't need to issue commands. It would simply curate the available truths. Let the rest of the Imperium come to the correct decisions on their own. Because if you control the inputs, data, memory, resource availability, you control the outcome. And if that's the case, then the High Lords aren't sovereigns. They're terminal nodes. When you think about it like that, it's no wonder that some fans believe Mars is the true capital of the Imperium. Not in name, not in appearance, but in influence. The kind that doesn't make declarations or speeches, but that ensures those declarations are already obsolete the moment they're made. And maybe that's why the Mechanicus always seems to smile, quietly, behind its metallic mask. Because while the rest of the Imperium burns, they're still building, still calculating, still watching, and maybe, just maybe, still ruling. If there's one institution in the Imperium that can make even a High Lord flinch, it's the Inquisition. It's the one organization that technically answers to no one, not the Adeptus Terra, not the Ecclesiarchy, not even the Senatorum Imperialis. And that's what makes their influence so unnerving. They don't need to control the High Lords openly. They just need to be present, to watch, to lean in ever so slightly at just the right moment. And suddenly, even the most iron-willed lord finds himself reconsidering a vote. The thing about the Inquisition is that it's not a monolith. It's a hydra. Every ordo has its own dogmas, agendas, and internal politics. And within each, there are Puritans and radicals, pragmatists and zealots, each believing they understand the true will of the Emperor better than anyone else. So when we talk about the Inquisition having influence over the High Lords, we're not talking about some unified conspiracy. We're talking about countless invisible threads, tugged by hidden hands, often in opposition to each other, and yet, somehow, all managing to shape the course of Imperial policy. Take the Ordo Malleus, the Demon Hunters. Their very existence is a secret to most of the Imperium, and their operations are so compartmentalized that even full planetary governors are often unaware of their presence. Yet somehow, we see policy shifts across entire sectors, new warp interdiction protocols, elevated suspicion towards specific mutant strains, sudden spikes in Black Ops funding for non-Astartes combatants. These aren't just military decisions. They're cultural pivots, and they always seem to follow a pattern of Ordo Malleus intervention. There's a theory that some of the High Lords themselves are, or once were, Inquisitors. It wouldn't be unheard of. The Inquisition has access to virtually every part of the Imperium. They can disappear people, seize resources, even commandeer entire fleets without permission. If an Inquisitor wanted to rise to the Senatorum, who would stop them? And if they got there, who would question their motives? They already live in a world where secrets are currency. Becoming a High Lord would just give them a bigger vault. But it's the more obscure Ordos that really raise eyebrows in the fan community. Take the Ordo Kronos, officially defunct, right? Supposedly wiped out in some kind of temporal implosion or lost in paradox. But there are whispers that Chrono Inquisitors still operate, detached from linear time, showing up at key historical moments with just the right push. Some even say they're tasked with preserving a certain version of history, nudging reality back on track whenever it strays too far. And if that's true, then how many High Lords have been removed not for what they did, but for what they would have done? There's something terrifying about that idea. That somewhere, there are Inquisitors who already know what kind of threat a Lord will become, and act before it even happens. That's not politics. That's preemption. And if you believe the deeper layers of that theory, then it's not just the present being manipulated. It's causality itself. Then there's the Ordo Scriptorum, one of the newest and most subtle branches. Their job is to manage Imperial records to ensure that dangerous knowledge doesn't spread. But with that kind of power comes the ability to reshape history itself. There are entire campaigns, entire worlds that we only know about through oblique references in forgotten tomes. What if some of those stories were censored? What if the actions of a particular High Lord were adjusted, rewritten, removed? We wouldn't know, and that's exactly the point. Exactly. And of course, we can't forget the radicals. Every Ordo has them. Inquisitors who think the ends always justify the means, who use Xenos tech, consort with sanctioned mutants, even dabble in sorcery, just enough to fight fire with fire. If one of those Inquisitors decided a High Lord was in the way, what recourse would there be? Who would investigate the Inquisition? Themselves? This leads to one of the more disturbing theories floating around, that the Inquisition doesn't just influence the High Lords, they vet them, that behind every appointment is an inquisitorial audit, a quiet thumbs up or down based on things the public never sees, loyalty tests, psychological conditioning, even memory tampering. And if someone resists that process, well, we've already talked about the Vanishing Act, haven't we? It's not even about conspiracy at this point. It's about architecture. The Imperium is built to allow this kind of influence. The High Lords operate in the open, in the light of what little reason remains. But the Inquisition? They thrive in the shadows. They are the shadows. And when the light flickers, and it always does in the Imperium, they move. And what's most frightening is that maybe this isn't even malicious. Maybe the Inquisition truly believes they're protecting humanity, that the High Lords, for all their power, are still just cogs. Important cogs, yes, but expendable if the machine begins to seize. That perspective, that cold, absolute dedication to the long-term survival of the species, might be what makes them the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Because in the end, a High Lord answers to his peers. An Inquisitor answers only to the Emperor. And the Emperor? Well, he hasn't spoken in 10,000 years. So maybe the Inquisition is the voice now. The question is, whose voice is it, really? There's a name that's only ever whispered in the darker corners of lore discussions, passed around like a secret too dangerous to say out loud. Not because it's forbidden, exactly, but because of what it implies. The Faceless Regents. The theory that there exists a hidden caste of rulers, ones who never take a seat among the High Lords, never appear in any record, never sign their names to decrees, but whose influence shapes every major decision that comes out of Terra. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard about them, I laughed it off. It sounded like tinfoil hat nonsense. But the more I read, the more I started to feel that itch in the back of my brain, the one that whispers, what if? The story usually starts the same way, a curious observer digging through conflicting records. They'll notice, say, that a decision attributed to the High Lords contradicts their public voting record, or that a major policy shift occurred without a single official speech, briefing, or prepared budget, just action, as if the machinery of the Imperium had suddenly adjusted course overnight. And buried in these strange shifts, there's always some mention of external advisement, classified consultation, or, my personal favorite, by higher directive. Higher than the High Lords? That's the seed that births the legend. According to the most popular version of the theory, the Faceless Regents are not part of the Senatorum at all. They're a separate entity, hidden deep within the Imperial Palace, possibly even beneath the throne itself. They don't rule openly. They don't issue commands with seal and parchment. Instead, they whisper. They manipulate. They appear in private, unrecorded meetings, always in pairs or trios, never named, never referred to by title. Some say they wear plain robes. Others say they are robed in gold, but never remove their masks. No one agrees on what they look like, only that their presence leaves a residue of fear. One particularly eerie version of the legend says that every High Lord is assigned a silent advisor upon their appointment. This figure does not speak in public, does not attend votes, but is always nearby. And over time, their voice becomes the only one that truly matters. They don't give orders, not directly. They offer suggestions, warnings, gentle reminders of how fragile power really is. Some believe that these advisors are not even human, clones, psyker constructs, or remnants of ancient AI bound by the Emperor's last command. Others insist they're just men and women with too much knowledge and no official accountability. And maybe that's the most terrifying version of all. There are a few stories that seem to give this theory some weight, scattered reports, obscure Black Library hints, and a handful of lore fragments that never quite add up. There's a fragment of a report in the Macarian Apocrypha that refers to a council of unseen advisors who approved a crusade months before the High Lords supposedly did. In the Valedict Eclecticus, a rogue archivist claims to have seen a redacted name on a decree that carried more clearance than the Inquisition itself. And in the Voice of Terra, an anonymous voxcaster describes a dream in which golden-masked figures argued over the fate of Segmentum Solar, a full year before any known events occurred. Of course, it could all be coincidence. There's so much disinformation, censorship, and conflicting canon in the Warhammer setting that almost any theory can be stitched together with enough tattered scraps. But there's something about this one that resonates on a deeper level, because it explains too much. The disappearances, the impossible coordination, the eerie moments of silence before sudden action. A council that rules by absence, not presence. One of the darkest theories surrounding the Faceless Regents is that they are remnants of the Emperor's pre-heresy design, custodians of an ancient protocol meant to preserve the Imperium in the event of his incapacitation. Not the Custodes, not the High Lords, something older, a sleeper mechanism. They are not individuals with names and personalities, but custodians of roles. Roles passed down through ritual and silence, protected by secrecy so total that even the Inquisition fears to ask. The theory claims that they were activated shortly after the Emperor was interred on the throne and have never stood down since. Some fans speculate that this hidden caste is connected to the Sigillite's final works, the last orders Malcador gave before his death, that they are his successors not in title, but in function. Eternal advisors to a throne that no longer speaks. There's even a theory that they use fragments of the Emperor's own mind, psionic echoes embedded in ancient archaeotech, to guide their decisions. That when a regent speaks, it is not their voice, but his. But even if none of that is true, even if the Faceless Regents are just a fabrication, it still tells us something important. That we, the fans, need there to be an explanation for the things we see in the lore. For the quiet, calculated shifts that no mortal committee could engineer. For the order in the chaos. We invent these figures not because we want to believe in conspiracies, but because we want to believe someone is still steering the ship. And maybe that's the real power of the Faceless Regents, not in their supposed control over Terra, but in the myth they've become. A myth strong enough to make us question everything we think we know about authority in the Imperium. Because if they do exist, they're the ultimate expression of what the Imperium has always been, a place where truth is a weapon, history is a tool, and the real rulers never show their faces. This is where things get really weird, like warp weird, because if you follow the more esoteric corners of Imperial lore, eventually you'll stumble onto a theory that's as disturbing as it is fascinating. That the High Lords of Terra aren't just influenced or manipulated, they're controlled. Not politically, not economically, psychically. That someone or something is actively puppeteering them through the immaterium. And as ridiculous as it sounds at first, the deeper you dig, the more it starts to feel plausible. In that horrifying Warhammer 40K kind of way. Let's take a step back. We know psychers exist. We know the Imperium uses them in everything from battlefield communication to weapons of mass destruction. We also know that the Emperor himself, may he sit forever in golden silence, was and is the most powerful psyker humanity has ever known. So if psychic power is real and potent and integrated into the highest functions of the Imperium, then it's not exactly a leap to think someone might be using it to nudge the minds of even the most powerful humans in the galaxy. There's an idea floating around in some fan circles that the Senatorum Imperialis is laced with psychic influence, subtle, continuous, and utterly undetectable. That the moment a new High Lord is appointed, a tether is formed. Not a leash exactly, but more like a pressure valve. When the mind begins to resist the flow of Imperial policy, when doubt, hesitation, or independent thought start to surface, that tether tightens. Thoughts are redirected, certainties reinforced, and the Lord never knows it happened. They simply feel that their decision was always the right one. Some fans tie this concept to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. After all, this is the institution that trains and oversees astropaths, one of the most mentally vulnerable and manipulated groups in the galaxy. They've perfected techniques of psychic conditioning and memory shaping. Is it so hard to believe they might apply similar methods to the highest echelons of power? That in the dark corners of the palace, there are sanctioned psychers whose entire purpose is to cleanse the thoughts of the ruling class? There are even older and darker theories, ones that stretch back to the dark age of technology. According to these, the Imperium didn't just inherit ruined tech from a forgotten past. It inherited tools of governance that make modern tyranny look like child's play. Thought engine arrays, neuro-overload circuits, entire systems designed to override free will with comforting suggestion. If even fragments of this technology survived, it wouldn't take a massive operation to implement. Just a single node, tucked into a throne, a robe, a crown, a whisper buried in static, a command hidden inside a choir's chant. And then there's the matter of the Golden Throne itself. It's not just a chair, it's a psychic amplifier, a gateway to the Astronomicon, and perhaps, according to some, it is still transmitting. Not just light through the warp, but intent, direction, memory. That when a High Lord enters the inner sanctum for council, they're not just receiving ceremonial wisdom, they're being rewritten line by line by the echoes of the Emperor's dying will. Or worse, by something else that's taken up residence inside the throne's circuits, something ancient and hungry for control. One particularly haunting theory is that of the Throne Echo, a psychic residue of the Emperor's consciousness that didn't fully die, but instead fractured. Each fragment retains some element of his will, order, discipline, war, sacrifice, and these shards imprint themselves on the minds of key Imperial figures. High Lords who oppose these themes experience migraines, memory loss, and eventually, silence. Those who comply find their convictions harden inexplicably, as if their loyalty is being rewarded by a warmth they can't describe. Is it divine affirmation or psychic conditioning? Some say this explains why certain High Lords make decisions that seem completely out of character. A pacifist suddenly calls for a system-wide purge. A logistical expert insists on wasteful crusades. A diplomatic envoy begins advocating for scorched earth protocols. To the public, these are shifts in policy. To those watching more closely, they're lapses, tiny cracks where a mind has been bent too far. Of course, not everyone believes in literal psychic control. There are more grounded interpretations too. Some fans propose that it's not about possession, but environmental influence. That the palace itself, the walls, the artifacts, the noospheric background, has been saturated over 10,000 years with psychic energy. Simply existing there begins to wear down resistance. The longer you remain a High Lord, the more your thoughts start to match the palace's. And eventually, you're no longer thinking your thoughts at all. And that's where the real horror creeps in. Because whether it's a psyker's hand, a fragment of a god, or just the slow erosion of will by unseen forces, the result is the same. Rulers who are no longer ruling. At least not consciously, not entirely. They believe they are, of course. That's part of the illusion. But deep down, they're following a current they can't see and couldn't fight even if they tried. The scariest thing? If this is true, then there are no true traitors among the High Lords, no true dissent, only degrees of compliance. And that, more than any assassin's blade or political purge, is what keeps the Senatorum so eerily stable. Not loyalty, not fear, just perfect seamless influence. Minds shaped like clay beneath the gentle pressure of powers that never show their face. And when you realize that, you start to wonder, what happens when someone does resist? Do they break? Do they disappear? Or are they simply remade? There's an old saying in the underhalls of Terra, who feeds the machine decides where it marches. And while most people look to the High Lords, the Inquisition, or the Mechanicus when they think about power in the Imperium, there's another axis of control that rarely gets the spotlight, but probably should. The Navigator houses and the ancient trade dynasties. They're not officially part of the Senatorum Imperialis, but their reach, it's everywhere. Quiet, elegant, and often devastatingly effective. Let's start with the Navigators. These aren't just glorified pilots. They are the literal lifeblood of Imperial logistics. Without them, interstellar travel would collapse. Warp jumps would become suicide missions. Fleets would be stranded. Crusades would fail before they left the system. So naturally, the Navigator houses, those ancient mutated bloodlines blessed with the third eye, have carved themselves a place at the very edge of true power. Not through force, through necessity. And here's where things get murky. The Navis Nobilite has a seat among the High Lords. That's public knowledge. But the real decisions? They're made in private, behind the sealed doors of the great Navigator enclaves scattered across Terra and the Segmentum capitals. There, generations-old pacts are negotiated. Favor is exchanged for silence. One house offers exclusive passage through a stable corridor of the warp. Another withholds their navigators until certain political outcomes are secured. It's not blackmail, it's business. And when business involves the fate of 1 billion lives, it tends to carry weight. A lot of fans think that the Navigator houses don't just influence policy, they directly control the outcome of some High Lord decisions. Think about it. A Lord Militant plans a crusade. He needs warp routes. The Navigators control those routes. If House Belisarius refuses to cooperate, the crusade stalls. If House Brobantus offers elite navigators at a discount, the campaign is greenlit. The High Lords may wear the crowns, but the navigators own the roads. Then there's the economic layer, the Chartist captains, the merchant dynasties, the rogue trade clans. These families have wealth that makes even sector governors look like beggars. They don't sit on thrones, they sit on fleets, private armies, entire manufactoria worlds under indirect control. And unlike most of the Imperium, they're mobile. They can walk away from a bad deal, which gives them leverage that's almost impossible to counter. There's a theory I've always liked, one that says the High Lords don't issue economic policy, they react to it. That behind every new tithe increase, every supply reroute, there's a trade faction that lobbied for it, greased the right palms, and quietly threatened to pull support unless their interests were protected. This isn't heresy. It's how the Imperium stays afloat. It's the price of keeping a galactic empire running on rust and blood. Some lore threads even hint at silent seats, unofficial representatives of powerful merchant guilds who attend the meetings of the High Lords without ever being named or recorded. Observers, advisors, sometimes even hosts. One archived reference from the Journals of Lythe Prim mentions a masked figure who spoke with the authority of coin and void. No name, no title, but everyone in the chamber listened. That's not a lord. That's someone who owns lords. And we can't ignore the dynastic marriages. Navigator houses and merchant clans have been known to intermarry with minor nobility and even low-tier planetary governors. It's not romance. It's consolidation. It's influence by bloodline. Over generations, these alliances weave a web that stretches across the entire Imperium. A governor supports a trade policy because his son is betrothed to a navigator's daughter. A sector fleet prioritizes one route over another because it's funded by a guild that just signed a massive deal with a transport house. None of it's on the record, but the effects? You can see them in every redirected convoy and mysteriously prioritized world. There's even speculation among some fans that certain High Lords are descendants of these families, that their loyalty isn't to the Senatorum or even the Emperor, but to ancient contracts and promises inked long before they took the mantle. If true, it would mean that the Imperium's core is less a council of strategy and more a table of debts. A system where favors passed down over millennia dictate the course of the present. Of course, all of this happens in the shadows. No one openly accuses a High Lord of being owned by a merchant prince. But every so often, a trade policy emerges that makes no sense strategically, only economically. A fleet is deployed not to the front line, but to protect a mining operation owned by a navigator's cousin. A Forge World's output is redirected not to war zones, but to a rogue trader's supply network. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's the cost of doing business in a galaxy where survival is never free. In the end, the Imperium runs on a lie. It tells itself that faith and firepower are enough. But behind that lie, behind the Ecclesiarch's booming proclamations and the High Lord's ceremonial votes, there are ledgers, contracts, trade routes, and warp charts. And the ones who control those, quietly, patiently, are the real powers shaping the Imperium's future. Not with banners, not with armies, but with promises. And as the old guild saying goes, the Emperor protects, but we provide. Every time I start to believe that the High Lords of Terra are genuinely in control, that they're truly the apex of Imperial decision-making, I remember the stories. The odd ones. The decisions that don't make sense. The policies that felt more like reactions to pressure than results of internal debate. When you zoom out and look at the grand sweep of Imperial history, you start seeing cracks. Not just incompetence or miscalculation that's expected in a system this vast. No, these are moments where it feels like someone else was pulling the strings, and the High Lords were just going through the motions. Take the Cadian Gate incident during the latter years of the 39th millennium. Everyone talks about the defense lines, the shifting tides of chaos, the strategic back and forth. But what's always struck me was the bizarre delay in reinforcing Cadia during its most vulnerable period, after an enormous Chaos fleet was already on approach. The Astra Militarum had fleets ready. Reports from multiple fronts had already indicated a significant buildup of enemy activity, and yet the Senatorum didn't respond. Not until it was almost too late. It was a decision so illogical that it sparked accusations of treason within certain circles of the Administratum. The response from the High Lords? Classified threat assessment was ongoing. That's the excuse. But to this day, many believe they were stalled, either by internal sabotage or external command. Another example, the purge of the Jovian Technarchs. This event barely gets mentioned outside of Mechanicus-centric lore discussions, but it's one of those events that makes you stare at the page and ask, who thought that was a good idea? Jovian orbit was home to one of the most productive and cooperative tech enclaves outside of Mars, fully integrated with Imperial demands, stable and compliant. Then, almost overnight, the High Lords ordered their dissolution and replacement with a newly blessed Martian faction. The result? A supply chain disaster that crippled several key war fronts. There was no visible justification, no uprising, no heresy, just replacement. Fans have long speculated that this wasn't the Senatorum acting on its own initiative, but Mars flexing its muscle. A silent coup executed with polite signatures. And who can forget the third quadrant silence? This event is infamous among hardcore lore analysts. During the mid-41st millennium, communications with over 50 systems in the Crixus subsector ceased for nearly 7 years. The Senatorum refused to authorize investigations, not military deployments, not diplomatic overtures, nothing. When asked, they cited strategic containment concerns. It wasn't until a rogue trader published fragments of her journal, describing entire sectors being used as black site testing grounds, that public outcry forced a response. The High Lord's eventual explanation was convoluted and full of gaps. And let's be honest, when a council known for overreaction goes quiet, you know something's up. Many believe this was the Inquisition's hand at work and the Senatorum simply obeyed. There's a much more personal, tragic example that stuck with me. Lord Admiral Kurloff during the Penumbra Rebellion. Kurloff had a solid career, a reputation for logistical brilliance, and the loyalty of most Segmentum Pacificus. But then came the order, from the High Lords themselves, to withdraw his fleet mid-campaign and reassign him to a completely different war zone. The result? A loyal governor was flayed alive on public broadcast. The rebellion spread, the planet fell, and Kurloff, he died in an accident en route to his reassignment. The timing was too clean, the reassignment too pointless. Some say a navigator house had ties to the rebel faction. Others think the ecclesiarchy wanted the planet purged for its doctrinal impurities and used the Senatorum as a tool to destabilize it. And then there's the big one, the War of the Beast. The Senate's paralysis in the face of the Orc Empire was so profound that it nearly cost humanity its survival. Their actions weren't just slow, they were weirdly selective. Resources were misrouted. Crusades were launched in the wrong directions. Promising commanders were shuffled away from the front. It wasn't just incompetence. It felt like sabotage. Eventually, it was the reformed Adeptus Astartes that stepped in and took command, while the High Lords continued to debate titles and protocols. To this day, people argue whether some unseen faction within Terra wanted the war to go badly, or at the very least, wanted it to go long. Even more contemporary events like the rise of Roboute Guilliman offer strange inconsistencies. The High Lords were famously divided over his return. Some welcomed him, others resisted with a ferocity that didn't match the situation. And when Guilliman finally took command, he reshuffled the Senatorum, removing certain lords without resistance, almost like they were waiting to be dismissed. Were they just cowards? Or were they placeholders, knowing their time had ended? Some theorized that the return of a Primarch wasn't unforeseen. It was allowed. A conclusion reached not by mortal judgment, but by consultation with something older and more calculating. When you look at all these moments, a pattern begins to emerge. The High Lords act, but not always with purpose. They decide, but sometimes with too much precision, or too little. Their responses often reflect priorities that don't match battlefield needs, economic logic, or theological purity. They reflect someone else's agenda. And whoever that someone is, they're not in the chamber, not wearing a robe, not casting a vote. They're above all that, or beneath it, or inside it, wrapped around the Senatorum like a noose made of whispers and precedent, which leaves us with a chilling conclusion. The High Lords may be the voice of the Imperium, but they're not always speaking their own words. this is where things take a turn into the truly forbidden. Because if you've been following the threads long enough, if you've read between the lines of the lore and squinted at the inconsistencies in the records, you'll have seen it. A pattern, a silence, an almost deliberate omission. Not a name, not a codex, not even a heretical whisper. Just absence. And that's what makes this theory hit so hard. Because maybe, just maybe, the High Lords of Terra aren't the only council within the Imperial Palace. Maybe there's another one. A parallel council, older, quieter, and far more powerful. The theory goes by different names depending on who you ask. Some call it the Silent Council. Others refer to it as the Throne Watchers. And in the darker corners of the lore community, there's even a term passed around half-jokingly, half-seriously. The True Senate. The idea is simple but chilling. While the High Lords maintain the illusion of governance, another body acts behind the scenes. Hidden within the depths of the Imperial Palace, it doesn't just advise policy, it determines it. Without vote, without debate, without anyone outside the palace ever knowing. There are slivers of evidence if you know where to look. In the Carrion Throne, there's an offhand reference to those whose counsel never leaves the shadow of the Sanctum Imperialis. No names, no details, just the implication that even within the heart of humanity's most sacred fortress, there are those who operate outside the known structures of power. In vaults of Terra, we hear of chambered rooms sealed by gene-coded keys, accessible only to entities no longer acknowledged by any formal roster. Why would those even exist if not for a group that was meant to be forgotten? And that's the core of the theory. This hidden council isn't rogue. It's not heretical. It was created, intentionally, long ago, possibly even by the Emperor or Malcador the Sigillite himself. A failsafe. A mechanism for ensuring the continuity of power should the High Lords falter, fracture, or become too visible. It wouldn't have a name, because names can be traced. It wouldn't leave records, because records can be erased. Its members wouldn't be known, because known figures can be manipulated. It would exist in the margins, operating through proxies and whispers, like a skeleton beneath the flesh of the Imperium. Some fans believe that this hidden council includes high-ranking members of the Adeptus Custodes. Not the ones standing guard, but the few assigned to what's known as the Shadow Vault. The ones who carry no rank, answer to no command chain, and are said to walk the palace without being seen. Others suggest it's composed of psychers too powerful to be unleashed on the battlefield, sequestered in the Emperor's deepest vaults, bound by ancient pacts. Still others argue for a cabal of archivists, lore-keepers who've seen too much, who preserve forbidden truths and act as the mind of the Imperium when its body forgets how to move. There are even older, stranger theories that the Council includes non-humans. Not Xenos, not exactly, but beings altered so profoundly by warp exposure or forgotten technology that they no longer qualify as Imperial citizens. Entities that might once have served the Emperor directly, and who now exist in a state of undeath, undeclared and unknown, kept functional by arcane machinery in the depths below the palace. One whisper speaks of a figure known only as the Recorder, a being said to have perfect memory of every decree the Emperor ever gave, stored across thousands of crystalline minds, plugged into the data soul of the Imperium like a living backup system. Of course, all of this is speculation, and the fact that we have no confirmation is precisely why so many people believe it, because everything about the Imperium screams misdirection. You're told to look at the banners, the parades, the titles, but the true power always hides. Always. So if there was another council, something older, buried, sacred, and profane in equal measure, it would look exactly like this. It would feel like this. Hidden not just by secrecy, but by scale, by time, by the sheer inertia of forgetting. And it's not just about theory anymore, it's about behavior. The High Lords are reactive, not proactive. They legislate after crises, not before. Their policies shift suddenly, often without clear causality. They vanish and are replaced with minimal disruption. Their votes are sometimes mysteriously unanimous on issues that should be divisive. That's not politics. That's instruction. They're not leading. They're enacting. Some even believe the real council meets during the High Lord's recesses, when no record is kept. That between sessions, decisions are presented to them, already decided, shaped, and signed. All they do is give it voice. That's why, in certain records, a decree will bear the seal of the Senatorum before the session to approve it took place. A clerical error, or a glimpse behind the curtain. I think what draws fans to this idea isn't just the mystery, it's the terrifying logic of it. The Imperium is too massive, too convoluted, too dependent on inertia to be guided by open rule. But a hidden core, a still silent mind buried deep within Terra, that's exactly the kind of structure that would survive, that could persist through 10,000 years of war, betrayal, and madness. And if this true council exists, then the High Lords are only the face, the mask, the voice of a speaker we never see. And suddenly, the question isn't who rules the Imperium. It's whether anyone we know ever has. There's something about this topic that sticks with you. You dive in thinking it's just another curiosity, another slice of Imperial bureaucracy to overanalyze. But by the time you come up for air, you're looking at the entire Imperium differently. Because once you start peeling back the layers of the High Lords, once you start asking who's really in charge, you realize how little we actually know. And in a universe where ignorance is often the only protection we have from madness, that knowledge, no matter how speculative, is both intoxicating and terrifying. What makes the idea of hidden rulers so compelling isn't just the drama, it's the humanity, it's the paranoia, the sheer vulnerability of it. We want to believe that someone, somewhere, knows what they're doing, that the people who make the decisions have reasons, logic, vision. But what if they don't? What if they're just faces, some proud, some frightened, some complicit, sitting in thrones carved from myth while others, faceless and forgotten, write the real story from behind the curtains? It hits because it feels real, not just in the lore sense, but in the way it echoes our own fears about power and control, about how easily institutions become symbols, about how often history is shaped by those who are never recorded in it. In the Imperium, everything is grand, everything is sacred, but behind the liturgies and banners, there's always a crack in the marble, a whisper you're not meant to hear, a question that no one answers because the answer is too dangerous. And maybe that's why so many of us can't let it go. The Faceless Regents, the Silent Council, the idea that there's another layer, deeper and darker than even the Inquisition dares to touch. It's a story that gives shape to our unease. Because in a universe ruled by fear, silence is power, and the one who speaks last usually isn't the one in charge. What if this is the true horror of the Imperium? Not the demons or the Xenos or even the warp itself, but the possibility that no one really knows who's steering the ship. That the galaxy is caught in the gravitational pull of ghosts, echoing decisions made by minds we'll never see, never understand, and never hold accountable. It makes the High Lords feel less like leaders and more like survivors. Figures caught in the same web as everyone else. Some play the game, some follow orders, and some, maybe, think they're free. But all of them are part of a machinery that doesn't care about loyalty or legacy, only function. And yet, maybe there's beauty in that too. In the way people still try. In the idea that even a marionette can find moments of defiance. That beneath the weight of protocol, manipulation, and unseen influence, there are still those who burn with real conviction, who fight for what they think is right, even if they'll never know who handed them the sword. That's what makes this kind of theory more than just fan speculation. It's a lens, a way to see the soul of the setting, to imagine not just what is, but what could be lurking behind it. And in a setting like Warhammer 40K, where truth is weaponized and ignorance is armor, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is ask. So if this dive into the shadows of the Senatorum left you with questions, good. That's the point. If you've got your own theories about the Faceless Regents, the Silent Council, or whatever might be puppeteering the Imperium's highest thrones, I want to hear them. Drop them in the comments. Share what you think is really happening behind those palace walls, because maybe, together, we can map the shape of the thing that never shows itself. And hey, if this kind of deep lore dive is your thing, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and share it with your fellow lore freaks. The galaxy may be ruled by silence, but we're here to ask the loud questions. See you in the next one, where we'll dig even deeper into the myths, the whispers, and the truths we're not supposed to find. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, someone has to keep asking, why not us?